contributions from Nigel Williams, Margaret Drabble and Malcolm Bradbury now, as BBC4 celebrates the life and work of the writer of Anglo-Saxon attitudes, Angus Wilson.
The first writer I ever met was Angus Wilson. I met him at the University of East Anglia in 1964, the year he published his fifth novel, Late Call. My copy of this book is bound with one of those transparent plastic covers bookshops used to sell in the days before glossy jackets. They cost 9p each, and I only ever put them on books I sensed I would cherish. I remember his garden in Suffolk, where he and his companion Tony Garrett gave an annual summer party. The sun always shone. Tony poured champagne. The garden was full of old-fashioned flowers. Angus, resplendent in a purple bow tie and a white suit, was like a magnet, drawing everybody to him. There was a great deal of laughter. He admired Dickens and Dostoevsky for their extraordinary mixture of black and comic vision, which allowed them to see how profound absurdity can be and how utterly ridiculous most of the profound things are. A deep understanding of the way the comic illuminates the tragic pervades his own work. Angus is now 76 and gravely ill. He will write no more books. He lives in a nursing home near Bury St Edmunds. His novels no longer sell widely, and Tony struggles to find the money to pay the nursing home bills. Has the world forgotten what a great writer Angus Wilson was, and what a distinguished and heroic life he led? It seems as if it has.
When I read Rose Tremaine's article in the Independent magazine, I was genuinely shocked. Angus Wilson was one of those writers who I'd assumed would always be there. I'd known he was ill. People in the literary world had told me he had senile dementia. But surely his books had survived. I put a call in to his publishers.
Hello, could I have Secker and Warburg publicity, please? Oh, hello. I wonder if you could tell me whether you still have in print the novels of Angus Wilson. No, I don't. I mean, the eminent English novelist Angus Wilson, not A.N., different guy. Could you, I think you'll find that you do, actually, if you, I mean, he is quite a sort of, if you look through the files, I think you'll find that you do. Yeah, if you could. Thank you very much indeed. Bye.
Forget the knighthood. Forget the 8 novels, the 3 collections of stories, and the biographies. Forget the fact that, to a young man growing up in the 50s, he seemed the very model of what a writer should be. How could an author as public, as flamboyant, and as revered as that simply disappear? When I thought about Wilson, the first thing I remembered was the first story he ever wrote. As it happens, he only started writing when he was 34. It's a shocking little story called Raspberry Jam, about a lonely young boy. Johnny's world was a strange compound of the adult world in which he'd always lived and a book world.
Hi, Jack.
His imagination was taken by anything odd, strange faces, strange names, strange animals, strange voices and catchphrases. All these appeared in his games.
What book are you reading?
It's a story called Raspberry Jam. About a small boy who is, and I quote,
too much with women and has no friends of his own age. So he's incredibly unlike you. Johnny was playing with his farm animals. The ritual involved in the game was very complicated and had a long history. It was on his 9th birthday that he'd been given the farm set by his father. Something a bit less babyish than those woolly animals of yours, he'd said, and Johnny had accepted them since they made, in fact, no difference whatever to the games he played. The little ducks, pigs and cows of lead no more remained themselves in Johnny's games and had the pink woolen sheep and green cloth horses of his early childhood. Mummy was already saying that he was getting too old for the farm animals. One always seemed to be getting too old for something. But he hated the idea of throwing things away because they were no longer needed. Mummy and Daddy were always throwing things away and never thinking of their feelings. When he'd been much younger, Mummy had given him an old petticoat to put in the dustbin, but Johnny had taken it to his room and hugged it and cried over it. Daddy had been very upset. The young hero has befriended 2 elderly sisters. These social outcasts have asked him, on his own, for tea, but when he arrives, they're both horribly drunk. Suddenly, Miss Marion stepped forward, and holding the bird's head, she thrust a pin into its eyes. "We don't like spies round here looking at what we're doing," she said in her flat, gruff voice. "When we find them, we teach them a lesson so that they don't spy on us again." Then she took out a little pocket knife and cut into the bird's breast. Its wings were beating more feebly now, and its claws only moved spasmodically, whilst its chirping was very faint. Little yellow and white strings of entrails began to peep out from where she'd cut. "Oh!" cried Miss Dolly. "I like the lovely colours. I don't like these worms." But Johnny could bear it no longer. White and shaking, he jumped from his chair, and seizing the bird, he threw it on the floor, and then he stamped on it violently until it was nothing but a sodden crimson mass.
Raspberry Jam, everybody agrees, was Angus Wilson's first story, and he wrote it partly as a result of seeing a psychotherapist. He had a nervous breakdown while working in official secrets at Bletchley Park during the Second World War, and a combination of factors caused the nervous breakdown, but the result was that he went to see a psychotherapist, Dr. Costellitz in Oxford, who recommended that Angus should write down his dreams, and the dreams eventually turned into short stories. And Raspberry Jam draws on a macabre vein in Angus's own character and personality, and it reflects, I think, very much the loneliness of his childhood. What is so shocking about the story is the incident of violence. And I think there's some sadomasochistic nerve in Angus that he was very, very frightened of.
I can recall that as a very small child, like many other children, I was often barbarously cruel to insects. More disturbing to me is the recollection that at as late an age as 15, I deliberately burned moths in the flame of a candle that lit my bedroom in the seaside house we rented during the summer holidays. I also remember clearly that this childish perversity was closely connected with sexual excitement, and that the moths were fairly conscious substitutes for boys at school who had aroused my lust. Suppressed lusts, laced with sadism, are, of course, the commonplaces of English public school education.
Lust and sadism. I couldn't somehow associate these qualities with the delightful old gentleman I once met in the early 80s, who looked more like the nicer type of aunt than someone haunted by dreams of blood and cruelty. And that voice, it was more delightful and delovely than Dessard, wasn't it?
I was born in 1913 on the south coast of England. My parents were already getting on in years. My father 48, my mother 44. I was the youngest of 6 sons. My father was of an upper middle class family and of Scots origins. By the time I was born, his income had seriously diminished. We lived in genteel poverty, somewhat unevenly, but if my father didn't care to work, he was devoted to gambling, and the family income fluctuated with his lucky streaks. In my boyhood and adolescence, indeed, Financial necessity dictated that we should live in small hotels and boarding houses. We once sunk to the depths of middle-class shame of a house at which all the boarders ate at one table. But here I am only concerned with the kind of small boy who was growing up in them. For this purpose, all I need to convey is the picture of a lonely and spoilt child learning about the nature of the world from unhappy, pseudo-sophisticated, déclassé adults.
Now I've lost me bloomin' way, lost me bloomin' watch, and I can't find the blasted out.
His parents used to call him our little mistake, and I've seen photographs of him dressed up as a little girl, not an uncommon practice early this century. Mrs. Wilson was a very strict Christian Scientist who died when Wilson was 15. He never really spoke of his feelings for her. Wilson looked after his rakish Edwardian father with absolute devotion. He often said that he wanted to be the daughter the old man never had. In one of his autobiographical stories, he mentions his habit of flirting with Mr. Wilson Sr. and wanting to be a better wife to him than his mother had been. There was something in the family that was a clue to this dark, macabre side to Wilson's fiction. But what? Wilson spent much of his early childhood with his niece, Jean. This is a home movie made by Jean and her husband.
I know very well how much a full knowledge of a writer's life, yes, I suppose even of his unconscious life, adds to the interpretation of his work. But I'm more and more disinclined to expose skeletons that have been so carefully buried.
Oh no. I've got to ask this appallingly prurient question, and Jean doesn't help matters by looking so like her uncle. She has his eyes, the same look of puzzled amusement. Wilson said in an interview with the New Review towards the end of his life that 3 of his brothers were gay. It's quite a high strike rate in a family.
Well, Colin, I think he said yes. But I would have thought Uncle Pat was so correct, perhaps by nature, if that's the right expression. He was, but he was so correct, you know, that I'm sure he would never have gone, well, how to describe it, gone any further with it.
It was always possible, of course, that there was no mystery or dark secret in the Wilson family. But also true that what the Anglo-Saxon family chooses to reveal or conceal about itself to the outside world is one of the major subjects of his fiction. Perhaps all English middle-class families have the same dark secret. Nobody really knows anything about anyone else involved.
You mean that he's homosexual?
Yes, of course.
He's so popular, he's so good with the... Oh, it's the end of the world. I'm not entirely Victorian, you know, Mark. But I don't know that you'll want to hear all this, Mother.
Why shouldn't I? If it's going to help Ray. Oh, because he's a homosexual, you mean? I never knew how to pronounce it before. Well, you see the word nowadays in so much, don't you, in books and things? I've never thought of it in connection with anyone I love.
Does the key to the Angus Wilson story lie outside the conventional middle-class family that he uses so often in his fiction? After all, he himself chose not to be a part of such a unit. He made his way through Westminster, Oxford, and the British Museum in the style of what you used to be able to call a gay bachelor. Some of his friends from those days are still with us.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to see you. Among them, Bentley Bridgewater.
I saw Angus as being this sort of figure who spent all the afternoons with the curtains drawn, you know, with the sun shining outside, whereas I was being vigorous and open air and all that. And so I had formed the impression that this was a very decadent life he led.
He was sort of aesthete.
An aesthete, yes, if you like, certainly.
My London sophistication and my Westminster schooling and my camp carry-on attached me to the Oxford University Dramatic Society, where I played in Marlowe's Dr. Faustus. But my greatest success was in A Smoker, to which Peter brought Ivor Novello and Gladys Cooper. Here I did a skit of a well-known, I think, debutante, who had played the heroine in Faustus with a coy song, I Won't Be Kissed on the Lips, and represented one of the deadly sins in a chorus. How 90s our views still were may be seen by the fact that I represented the sin by wearing flame-coloured pyjamas and carrying a Madonna lily.
Which particular vice did he choose?
Buckaroo.
He sounded like a man pretty difficult to control.
He had a very good idea of how far to go. And later on, when he had a nervous breakdown, he went very far, but always kept just within the limits, you know. They didn't throw him out or anything of that sort.
Did anything precipitate his breakdown?
Angus could not bear being in a situation in which he had to obey the rules, you know. He was hemmed in by wartime restrictions. And so, for to give you an example, he liked going around with me, and he was on permanent day shift, whereas I was on three shifts. And so we didn't always come together to coincide. This used to make him absolutely furious.
I now learned that I could hate intensely, if not for long periods, and that I was capable of cruelty, indeed addicted to it, particularly towards those who attracted me most strongly. I fell really in love for the first time. Perhaps my father's death 3 years before had liberated me, and the panic that had been packed beneath the lid since my childhood at last broke loose. For some years, the panic itself so fascinated me that I could do nothing but analyze it. But finally, the nervous crisis gave me the freedom to write. Indeed, imposed the freedom on me as an obligation.
Wilson's short stories were published to great acclaim. They're brilliant on the ironies of life in great English liberal institutions, places like the British Museum, or indeed the British Broadcasting Corporation.
I don't think it's good enough to just take 5% cuts across the board. So I'd like you to go back to all the departments and really ask them to re-examine what they've given us so that we can then really begin to make some decisions.
Do you want to be involved in those meetings, those negotiations, or...?
No, I think that's best left. As you know, John said, I've got some very big ideas for the Institute. I'm not an expert in any way, as you people are, but I think that's possibly why I've been chosen for the job. The board felt that this place needed a man with administrative experience, whose training had led him to take an overall view of things, to think, shall I say, widely rather than deeply. Do I understand that people will be put over us? Asked Mrs. Scruton. In some cases it may be necessary to make revisions in seniority, replied John, and opening the door he bowed them out. Golly, said Veronica, you do tell some lies, don't you? Or have the board ratified your staff changes? How many more times must I tell you, Veronica, that truth is relative, said John. I cannot help being satisfied when I think of the well-merited, unpleasant few weeks those three are going to have. The punishment of incompetence is always satisfactory. Said Veronica doubtfully. What's that mean? You're not getting sentimental, are you? Good Lord, no, said Veronica. It's not those misfits I'm worrying about. It's you. Me? Said John. Why? You're getting too fond of bullying, said Veronica. It interferes with your charm, and charm's essential for your success. What Veronica said was very true, thought John, and he made a note to be more detached in his attitude. All the same, these criticisms were bad for his self-esteem. For all her loyalty, Veronica knew him too well. His imagination began to envisage further staff changes. Perhaps a graduate secretary would really be more suitable. It's a marvellous short story. It's about a young man, very charming, who is sent into a major institution and to try and reform its ways. And really it charts the way he bumps up against the loyalties and the ingrained history of the place. And it's amazing reading it because you think it could have been written yesterday. I mean, it's just so recognizable about all the stories you've read in the papers about the Thatcher years and all the institutions, this one included, the BBC, being sort of forced to review themselves and bring themselves up and realign themselves with a different culture.
I've chosen extracts which represent various clashes, almost, I would say, representations of infernos in the modern world. Eric realized suddenly that the future frightened him. As though to point the moral, Ron, in his pale peach shirt and silver tie, came across the lawn towards them. I wondered if I'd see you here, seeing as you were such a good friend of Mr. Sands, said Ron, who was sexing with his eyes to an almost painful degree. When Bernard didn't reply, Ron said archly, I don't seem to appeal to you.
I remember reading Hemlock and After in the late 1950s. I had come to terms with my own homosexuality then, realized that I was gay. And so it was a revelation for me, because then I was a criminal too. I was a criminal up until the age of 29. I realized that this man was writing about homosexuals like other human beings. He wasn't making them a class apart. He wasn't sort of banging on a drum and, you know, doing something for the cause. What he was doing was showing that they are just human beings. They're like anybody else. They're as mean, as ungenerous, or as kind as considerate as anybody else.
Hemlock and After was Wilson's first novel. Hemlock was the poison Socrates was forced to drink for corrupting youth. An English hypocrisy is poison to the liberal hero Bernard Sands. The book's dedicated to Tony Garrett, who'd become Wilson's constant companion when the book was published in 1952.
When I left school, 16, I started work in the British Museum, and Angus came back from doing war service with the Codes and Ciphers, Bletchley Park, and he came back on the 31st of December 45, which was the day on which I started work. And curiously enough, we actually met on that day in the front hall of the British Museum. I can't remember what he said to me, some jolly remark, and I can't remember what I thought, except I thought he was very extraordinary. I mean, I thought the whole, I mean, being your first day at work is quite, you know, a strange thing anyway, but to meet somebody, you know, like Angus on your first day of work was quite a shock, you know. It took about 3 weeks to get over it.
In Hemlock and After, Bernard Sands educates Eric, a young boy who is his lover, very much as Wilson helped the young Tony Garrett.
To a certain extent, it was based upon me as I was then, as a boy. Carefully, Eric arranged his belongings on the small table: road map, dark glasses, sketchbook, and copy of Madame Bovary. He had read in a Reader's Digest that the process of arranging one's thoughts in good order was often helped by an equally careful ordering of external objects. Modern psychology, it had explained, was replacing the old-fashioned Freudian idea of the unconscious controlling the conscious by a simpler, more common-sense control of thought by action. Bernie had said it was all balls, but at the same time it was Bernie who so constantly urged him to control and limit his fantasies by achievement.
He was a novelist much concerned with the psychological dimension of fiction and, of course, of his own characters. He believed that people did lead strong unconscious lives, and that the problems of the British novel was that it had very little language for representing this. And Angus tried a great many different ways of exploring the psychological. There's a key scene in the book in Leicester Square when a young man is arrested for homosexual importuning, and Bernard Sands is asked to inform on him by the detective who makes the arrest. And he experiences a shock of obscenity, as it were. That is to say, he realizes that somehow he has become identified not simply with the forces of authority, but something even crueler still, the desire to hunt others.
My dear, whatever was happening? Terence came up as the arrested man was led off. They've arrested him for importuning, said Bernard in a dead voice. Terence gave him a quick look. Oh, my dear, I'm so sorry, he said. Taxi, he called. Taxi! As they rode in the taxi, he put his hand on Bernard's arm. It's absolutely beastly, I know, but there's nothing one can do. And it's so frightening. Frightening for oneself, I mean. But it was neither compassion nor fear that had frozen Bernard. He could only remember the intense, the violent excitement that he had felt when he saw the hopeless terror in the young man's face, the tension with which he had watched for the disintegration of a once confident human being. He had been ready to join the hounds in the kill then. It was only when he had turned to the detective that his sadistic excitement had faded, leaving him with normal disgust.
The climate of guilt must have been extraordinary in those days.
I did get blackmailed. It was a young man that I'd met called Charlie. He was quite fun. But just one day, suddenly he said, I think I'm going to need quite a lot of money from you. And then it started, and it wasn't at all pleasant. Because this was a job where it couldn't be known that I was gay and so on and so on. And I did fork out quite a lot of money which I could ill afford, and got frightened of, when I answered the telephone, would it be him with, I'm wanting a money, that's the thing, and so on. And that was the nasty side.
Wilson was always completely open about his sexual life, and indeed most other things. The hypocrisy of the English public is the theme of Anglo-Saxon Attitudes, a novel about an archaeological fraud and a bad marriage, held together by a ghastly matriarch called Inga. The Anglo-Saxon Attitudes of the title, you get the impression there's something he doesn't like about them.
Yes, well, I think it's the stiff, formal, accepted ideas of what we should be and how we should behave and what our duty is and how a husband should be and how a wife should be and how a mother should be and how a father should be. And one does get a sense throughout the book that there are a lot of rather wild, passionate characters trying to force themselves into these Anglo-Saxon attitudes which don't really suit them at all.
Yeah, but isn't this book ultimately very pessimistic, very negative?
It's quite a bleak book. It moves from extreme pessimism to cautious optimism, which in a way sounds an awful thing to say about it because it's such a funny book and you fall about laughing quite a lot of the time. I think what it celebrates is things like intelligence and humour, honesty particularly, honesty about yourself. And also, which I like, of course, it celebrates sensuality, that anybody who follows their desires in the story gets quite a lot of sympathy, you feel, from Angus Wilson. It's a bit like saying, everybody should come out, not only the gays.
Could you read us something from Anglo-Saxon Attitudes that illustrates his talent?
Yeah, this is one of my favourite bits from early on in the book. It's at Christmas, and Inga has got her special carol concert with a lot of little children and neighbours and their parents, and it all goes rather wrong. And now all tendency to laughter was submerged in parental admiration as the little girls advanced, singing, Eristein Rose entsprungen. They held their white gowns bunched in one hand, and in the other a candle. There was a certain amount of squealing as drops of hot grease fell on hands and heads, but Mrs. Middleton had found no way but Spartan courage to meet the situation. She'd tell them the story of the boy and the fox at rehearsals, making it sound strangely pretty. And though the little fox bit and bit the little boy's tummy, she had said, did the little boy make a sound? No, he was a very brave little boy, And little girls can be brave too. And her singing, rising accent put all the sweetness she could command into the word brave. At the end of the song, Mrs. Middleton called out a very angel-pretty little boy of 6 from the audience. There was nothing she liked more than angelic faces in children. And now, little Morris will sing a verse of Holy Night, and we shall sing the choruses. Little Morris is a very shy, special little boy, she said to the audience, so we must all help him. When no sound came from his terror-struck mouth, she bent down from the heavens above, and placing her huge doll's face close to his, she asked, "What is the matter, Morris? Have the trolls bewitched your tongue?" So creating a deep psychic trauma that was to cause him to be court-martialed for cowardice many years later in World War III.
Tony Garrett and Angus Wilson moved to Suffolk in the late 50s. By now they were living together. Tony was then forced to give up his work as a probation officer because of their relationship. Angus took a job teaching English literature at the University of East Anglia.
One of the interesting things we did together was to start up the creative writing MA, which was the first time that anybody had taken creative writing seriously in a British university. Angus always was much more interested in the creative self of the writer, where writing comes from underneath, looking into the soul and the spirit and saying, come on, there is something troubling you there, that is what you are going to have to drive through, work with, to be a writer.
He brought this wonderful passion into the classroom. He only taught the books that he really felt passionately about. It was as if he didn't want to treat literature as something sort of external to life.
He took the view that the circumstances of a writer's life, whom he knew, what his love life was like, was of some relevance to the work. And at the end of these lectures, there would be a stampede to the bookshop. And suddenly, the Furbank, the Ford Madox for the Ivy Compton Burnett, which had been standing there for months untouched, would be stripped from the shelves. They were such marvellous celebrations.
Angus Wilson gave a series of lectures called Skating on Thin Ice, and those lectures were interesting in relationship to his own work. He had in mind writers like Virginia Woolf, Ronald Furbank, Henry Green, all writers whom he thought had inquired into areas of psychological precariousness, into areas where the securities of social status, of a certain kind of fixed social identity, had been lost. And his metaphor for this process, his metaphor for this kind of risk-taking on the part of these novelists, was that they were skating on thin ice.
He thought that certain novelists became kind of petrified, is the word that he used, petrified in a sort of genre of their own making. And this had to be avoided at all costs, because it was very difficult to develop and to change and to kind of flower and grow as a writer if you were stuck in one way of writing and in one little corner, one little piece of territory.
The fictional territory Wilson chose for his first experimental novel was the London Zoo. It was a move away from 19th century fiction's compulsion to document the present or past lives of real people. The book, telling the story of rival factions within this most English of institutions, is set in the near future.
Now, people are attracted to animals because they are free.
Liberal Kant, Carter. People are interested in animals because they eat one another. The idea that nature has any claims to nobility is a romantic fiction. I'm surprised to hear you espouse it.
You are a godless man, Englander.
Religion also has its uses. Combined with nature, it can be used to control the more unruly elements in our society.
Firstly, it's a brilliant analysis of the way people behave towards each other within the confines of an institution. And secondly, it was a fantastic metaphor for this country. I mean, it's a story about London Zoo and how, in order to survive, it has to take on the politics and the prevailing ethos of the different political systems that come into power over a short period of time. And so you see this this very genteel institution transformed by the end, actually, when a sort of fascist right-wing government is in power and the keeper takes over.
My lords, ladies and gentlemen, we reopen as part of a greater purpose, as part of one Europe's plan to re-educate the nation to face the future. And that means coming to terms with our own violence.
A good novelist should know the immediacy of how to hold his readers, whether by plot or tension or wit, but his final effect is not immediate. It is to encourage reflection, to surprise obliquely, to throw light upon the deep places of life, not the surface.
I think Angus is a great novelist because he starts to change his habit of writing quite substantially and to emerge in mid to late career as a novelist committed to experiment, as a novelist committed to new forms of fiction and I think to new places to write fiction about.
No Laughing Matter is not, for me, an experimental work. That term implies a certain degree of unreadability. It is a willful, gaudy story told in an unashamedly camp, whimsical manner, complete with cast list, a father who sounds suspiciously like Wilson's own, and a militantly gay central figure called Marcus, who sounds like an amalgam of our own hero and his brothers. The book, spanning an epic scale of nearly 60 years, is perhaps as close as we'll get to that mystery of the Wilson family. The exhibition was ideal for the children. With their broad-brimmed hats, their fringe breeches, their lassos and their whips. In the wilds of West Kensington, the West was now long established. The Matthews family, that hot afternoon, might so easily have been frozen and stored away in the files of the National Film Institute. But what no recording machine yet invented could have preserved was the pioneer happiness, the primitive dream that for some minutes gave to that volatile, edged and edgy family a union of happy, carefree intimacy that it had scarcely known before and was never to know again.
He shows how fantasy arises as a way of both escaping from a terrible reality, the terrible reality of this family life, and also as a means of managing it. Each of the characters that the novel follows through are in some way scarred by this family experience. And what the novel shows is how they, so to speak, cope with that scarring, how they try to free themselves from the effects of their childhood, and yet how in their attempts to free themselves they constantly return, if you like, to the old obsessive battleground of family life.
Angus, I think, began to lose something of his audience with No Laughing Matter, which in my opinion is actually his best book. It was a difficult book to read. It's a book of distorting mirrors and a book that breaks its own frame constantly. There's an awful lot of parody in it, and therefore you need to know something about the writers who are being parodied, and which range from Shaw to Pinter and so on. And it was a book that I think lost him some of his older audience, while at the same time not exactly attracting a new audience, a youthful audience.
He did feel very threatened at times by what he saw as the fragility of his own reputation. I could never understand how somebody who had written the body of work that he had written could care what anonymous whippersnappers in the TLS said about him. I couldn't understand. I used to say to him, why do you even bother to read them? How could Douglas fail to see the brutal thrust with which the literary supplement's flatteringly long review had pierced her? For year after year, for 20 years now, yes, since she was 14 or less, she had been straining herself, tearing herself to pieces to put together human mosaics, to give movement and purpose and relationship to the creatures of her imagination, to set them working backwards and forwards in time, round and about in space. And now, this anemic, constipated, bad-breathed, underpaid failure lurking behind anonymity told her that all she had been doing was to play a glorified game of chess.
No Laughing Matter had a mixed reception. As if by magic, got the treatment often meted out by rising young novelists to those they feel are in their way.
Kith of Death. Perhaps the most striking feature of Angus Wilson's work is the consistent horror and loathing with which he regards the family. Allied to this is the interest in homosexual relationships and the generalized nastiness vulgarly associated with them, and with Wilson's novels. One of the few things I would rather run a mile than do is have an Angus Wilson character over for the evening. His fictional world, as he himself seems to acknowledge via Margaret in No Laughing Matter, is a nasty world. But this doesn't stop him being a great novelist. One would give Wilson the benefit of these grave doubts if it weren't for the scruffiness of so much of the writing.
He used techniques that would now be called postmodern techniques, experimental techniques, pastiche, parody, risking the form of the book in order to get a new effect and to break the borders. And that wasn't enough appreciated by the critics.
I don't want enormous praise all the time, that's silly. But I would like not to have people smile and sort of take it for granted that I must find it rather a nuisance. Yesterday's child is the sort of expression that one dreads to have people saying. How do you feel about being yesterday's child? The answer is I feel bloody awful about it, you know. But what can you do?
I certainly think his own desire to become more experimental meant that he lost an audience who had a certain expectation of what an Angus Wilson novel was like, which was no longer confirmed for them when they read No Laughing Matter or As If by Magic. But I think it has to do as well with a change in the cultural mood of Britain in the late 70s. Angus Wilson's fiction is the antithesis, if you like, of Thatcherism. It's a fiction that anticipates the coming of Thatcherism, I think, with great prescience, that selfishness, that materialism, that lack of sympathy and understanding for others. But it's not a fiction that's going to be enjoyed or read by an audience who are adapting themselves to a yuppie culture. There's another issue. Angus Wilson was an active campaigner in developing freedom for homosexuals. But I think by, again, the late 70s, the early 80s in Britain, there was a new hatred of the homosexual, and I don't know whether Angus Wilson's reputation suffered as a result.
He felt, certainly since the 79 revolution, that everything that he stood for and valued was being destroyed. And there was an enormous emphasis upon materialism and making it. All those values oppressed him, but it was an accumulation of feeling that the things for which he stood for in education and in the health service, and by the time we got to 85, that really it was a new revolutionary world, and he saw no way of influencing it or stopping it, and he wanted to get out.
Tony and Angus moved to France in 1985, but from the very beginning there was a sense of doom about the enterprise.
I think he saw that move to France as a way whereby a geographical move would at the same time be a psychological and an aesthetic move, that there he'd be able to write this work of pure verbal inventiveness, of a kind of verbal luxury, which he hadn't been able to write before. But by that stage he was already suffering from the illness which was to incapacitate him for 5 or 6 years, was in effect to cut him off from writing entirely. So the moment that he chooses a kind of freedom is also the moment at which he loses the physical capacity to enjoy that freedom.
Wilson's illness became worse. They had to return to England, and when Tony could care for him no longer, Angus went into a nursing home not far from the cottage they'd shared for so many years. Tony returned to a block of flats, looking out over what could be one of the bleaker landscapes from Wilson's early fiction. He spent every day at the nursing home, doing everything that had to be done for the now very sick novelist, returning home alone in the evening.
There was something very poignant about Angus's later days. Here was a man who had been writing all his life. A writer lives by writing and by experiencing the chance of going on recording the world around. And Angus was no longer able to do this and lived in this painful limbo, both knowing and not knowing, having the writer's mind but not the writer's capacity. And I've always felt terribly sad in a personal way, the way of friendship, but also a kind of terror, really, the writer's terror that the one thing that you live by begins to fail or is taken away.
The removal of a writer's work from the shelves might not seem a great matter. Business, after all, is business. But the sudden and complete annihilation of a talent as fine as Wilson's does seem to me to have something in common with those other, more serious marks of the new Philistinism, the burning of books, or the pronouncement of death threats against writers with whom you happen to disagree. Angus Wilson is a very good, sometimes a great, writer.
The writer and academic Sir Angus Wilson has died in Bury St Edmunds, aged 77. Sir Angus was Professor of English at the University of East Anglia from 1966 to 1978. He was knighted 11 years ago.
It's curious that we so often discuss dead writers in the present tense, and it's only with his death that Wilson seems to be coming back into fashion. In a few years, this eclipse will almost certainly be seen as temporary, but it's a story that stands as a grim warning to any writer, a reminder of how terrifyingly quickly we can move from the centre of the stage to the decent darkness of obscurity.
When Angus died, the news didn't reach me properly until the evening, so I called all the late-night journalists. But I was dismayed to find that many of the people that I called had not heard of Angus, even in the local press, and he was an East Anglian writer of great importance.
Dear Paul, mercifully Angus died peacefully. It has been a long and heartrending watch. There is a revival about which he grasped nothing. Excellent news. I only hope I can contribute adequately, but I'm so exhausted. And I just want to be with Angus. Love, Tony. I think of him as I first saw him almost 3 decades ago, with his mane of white hair, wearing his customary floppy bow tie, in the drawing room of his austere flat near Regent's Park, talking and talking while Tony poured champagne to a roomful of friends, and making everyone glad to be in his presence. For me, a delightful mystery endures. How could someone who talked quite so much listen so well? His ears missed nothing, not a single nuance. They captured, time and time again, the sound of the way we live now.
There are people from all parts of my life, and that's nice, and also, like everything that's worthwhile in life, rather nasty as well. And so I thank you very much, both for the delights and for those moments of macabre, and that's what I like to have in life. Thank you.
We're going
to make our way for Goodbye! Goodbye, everybody. I don't think I can...
Bye-bye, Angus.
I know. Well, there's so many people. He told me to meet him up at Hampstead Heath by the old blasted oak. I toggled up the hill in my Sunday gown. Oh, Lord, love me, how the rain came down. I was all wet through, I didn't know what to do. The rain through me shoes began to soak. Now I've lost me bloomin' way, lost me bloomin' watch, and I can't find the blasted oak.